"Can I play for food?" The words hung in the air like an insult at the Ivory Room, Boston's premier piano bar. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The black veteran stood motionless, his weathered military jacket hanging loose on his frame. His empty stomach clenched. The manager smirked. "This isn't a soup kitchen." More laughter. Sharp. Cutting. Security stepped forward. Patrons returned to their $20 cocktails and business deals. But they missed it, the way his fingers twitched at his sides with precision, the military straightness in his spine despite days without shelter, the quiet assessment in his eyes as they locked on to the gleaming grand piano. They had no idea who they'd just humiliated. They couldn't see the thousands of hours hidden in those dirt-stained hands. They never expected that in exactly 30 seconds, every single person in this room would fall completely silent. James Walker hadn't always been invisible. 15 years ago, his hands commanded respect at Juilliard, not pity on street corners. 12 years ago, they'd earned medals for field medicine under enemy fire in Afghanistan. His fingers had both created beauty and saved lives. Now they couldn't even get him a meal. The Ivory Room gleamed with privilege, polished mahogany, soft amber lighting that flattered aging executives. Waitstaff gliding between tables with practiced deference. At the center, a magnificent Steinway grand piano currently occupied by a young man playing competent but safe renditions of jazz standards, his technique pristine but soulless. The manager, Carson Phillips, on his gold name tag, surveyed his domain from behind the bar. Tailored suit, manicured nails, the practiced smile of someone who had mastered the art of making wealthy people feel important. "Another Macallan, Mr. Thornton?" Phillips leaned toward a silver-haired patron. "Excellent choice, sir." "Did you close that Harrison account?" "Brilliant work." James watched, standing just inside the entrance. 3 days without a proper meal had left him lightheaded. The saxophone player at the park had given him $5, but it wasn't enough. Not in this part of town. His gaze returned to the piano. His fingers itched. Muscle memory didn't fade, even when everything else did. A waitress noticed him, her smile faltering. She whispered to Phillips, who turned with narrowed eyes. "Sir." Phillips approached, voice pitched just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I'm afraid we have a dress code." James straightened. Military habits died hard. "I understand. I'm not here as a customer." "Then why are you here?" Phillips kept a careful distance, as if homelessness might be contagious. "I heard your pianist during my set break," James said quietly. "I'm a musician. Classically trained." Phillips' laugh drew attention from nearby tables. "Are you now? And let me guess, Carnegie Hall is just between gigs." "Juilliard, actually, before Afghanistan." James didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for money. Just food. I can play during his break." The current pianist finished his set, bowing to polite applause. He nodded to Phillips, indicating his 15-minute break. "Look at him," Phillips said to a nearby table of business executives. "Says he went to Juilliard." More laughter followed. James remained still. Dignity was sometimes all you had left. A young bartender watched the exchange, discomfort evident in her eyes. She'd started a month ago, long enough to know how Phillips operated, not long enough to become numb to it. "Mr. Phillips," she ventured, "maybe during Jake's break." "Emily, please. We're not a charity." Phillips turned back to James. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to leave before I call security." One of the executives, red-faced from too many drinks, chimed in. "Hey, let's hear Beethoven play. Might be worth a laugh." His companions chuckled. Phillips hesitated, seeing potential entertainment value. "You know what?" "Fine." Phillips gestured toward the piano with exaggerated courtesy. "The stage is yours, maestro. Amuse us." James felt every eye in the room. The weight of expectation, the anticipation of failure, the preparation for mockery. He'd felt worse pressure, mortar fire, screaming wounded, the silence after losing a patient despite everything you tried. The bartender Emily slid a glass of water across the counter as he passed, a small kindness. He nodded thanks. The piano bench was still warm from the previous player. James sat, adjusting the height with practiced hands. The keys gleamed, ivory and ebony perfection. How long had it been? 2 years since he'd touched a proper piano. Not since before the nightmares got too bad. Before the apartment was gone. Before he'd become invisible. His reflection in the polished black surface was a stranger hollow cheeks, untrimmed beard, eyes too old for his 40 years. But his hands. His hands remembered. "Any day now, maestro," Phillips called, generating more laughter. James closed his eyes briefly. What to play? Something to match their expectations of failure? Or something to silence them? The answer came easily. His mother had played it. His first teacher had refined it. Juilliard had perfected it. Afghanistan had preserved it. His mental escape during the worst moments. Chopin's Ballad Number, 1 in G minor. It began softly, deceptively simple. A question posed to an indifferent world. James positioned his fingers and took a breath. $10 says he can't make it through chopsticks, someone muttered, loud enough for James to hear. In response, James did something unexpected. He smiled. Then he began to play. The first notes were tentative, not from lack of skill, but from fingers remembering their purpose, like soldiers returning to formation after years of civilian life. Phillips folded his arms, waiting for the inevitable failure. Emily, the bartender, paused mid-pour. The room hummed with anticipation of embarrassment, that peculiar hunger for someone else's shame. "Is that supposed to be Chopin?" Phillips stage whispered, drawing titters from nearby tables. James didn't respond. The introduction was merely a prelude, a clearing of the throat before speaking. His left hand established the melancholy bass line while his right began to articulate the melody. A woman at a corner table lowered her martini glass, her brow furrowing in confusion. Something wasn't aligning with expectations. The notes were correct, precise, intentional. James felt the piano responding beneath his touch. A good instrument knows the difference between an amateur and a trained musician within seconds. His body remembered the proper posture, the wrist position, the subtle pedal work. The opening gave way to the first crescendo, still restrained, still introducing themes that would later collide. James leaned slightly forward, his shoulders relaxing as muscle memory took command. "He actually knows the piece," someone whispered. Phillips shifted his weight, discomfort replacing mockery. This wasn't following the script. Then James reached the first technical challenge, the cascade of notes that separates casual pianists from serious ones. His fingers moved with sudden precision, articulating each note with clarity despite their speed. The runs flowed like water finding its natural path. The conversational murmur that had continued through the opening died away. Glasses paused midway to lips. James was no longer in the ivory room. He was back in his mother's living room, her upright piano slightly out of tune but beloved. He was in practice room 12 at Juilliard, working until his fingers ached. He was in the makeshift rec center on bass, playing on a donated keyboard for fellow soldiers who needed a moment of beauty amid war. The piece built toward its first emotional peak. James let the music swell, no longer cautious. His technique was rusty, but the interpretation mature, something beyond mere notes, something that spoke of hope and loss and perseverance. Emily had stopped pretending to work, transfixed by the transformation happening before her. The homeless veteran had disappeared. In his place sat a musician. James reached the brief pause in the composition, a moment of stillness before the storm. He used the moment to glance up. The room had frozen. Faces registered confusion, reassessment, the uncomfortable recognition of premature judgment. Phillips had retreated behind the bar, his expression unreadable. The pause lasted only a second. Then James plunged into the heart of the piece, the turbulent middle section where Chopin demands everything a pianist has to give. Technically challenging passages flowed into emotionally complex ones. The tempo increased, his hands flying across the keys. An older man in an expensive suit leaned forward in his chair, recognition in his eyes. "My God," he murmured. "That's Juilliard technique." The red-faced executive who had mocked James earlier sat slack-jawed, his drink forgotten. James didn't notice. He had reached the section that had always moved him most, the point where technical precision meets raw emotion. His body swayed slightly as the music poured through him. Years of hardship channeled into every phrase. A memory surfaced, his commanding officer discovering his talent, arranging for him to play for wounded soldiers in the medical tent. The way their faces had changed, pain momentarily suspended by beauty. The way music had been a bridge when words failed. The piece built toward its climax, gathering momentum like a wave approaching shore. James's fingers commanded the keyboard with authority now, all hesitation gone. This was who he was beneath the weathered exterior. This was the truth of him. Phillips caught Emily's eye, a silent question in his expression. She held his gaze steadily, challenging him to acknowledge what was happening. The final section approached the most technically demanding part of the piece, difficult even for pianists who practiced daily. Impossible for anyone but a true master. James took a breath, hands poised. Everything in the room had stopped. Every eye fixed on those dirty, calloused fingers hovering over pristine keys. He descended into the finale, unleashing everything he had held back. His fingers flew across the keys with impossible precision. Arpeggios cascaded like waterfalls. Chords resonated with perfect balance. The final section of Chopin's ballad demanded technical mastery and emotional depth in equal measure, and James delivered both. The audience sat motionless. Several had closed their eyes, transported. Others leaned forward, watching his hands with disbelief. The red-faced executive who had mocked him earlier now stared open-mouthed, drink forgotten in his slack grip. Phillips stood frozen behind the bar, calculation visible in his eyes. This wasn't a homeless man playing recognizable tunes for spare change. This was virtuoso performance. As James approached the final climactic passage, a memory surfaced. His last recital before deployment. His mother in the front row, pride shining in her eyes. "Your music will be your anchor," she had told him. "No matter where you go, it will bring you home." Afghanistan had tested that theory. Dust and blood and chaos. The piano there, a battered upright in the recreation area, had missing keys and faulty pedals. Still he had played when he could, between missions, after losses. It had kept him human, until the IED, until watching half his unit disappear in fire and noise, until the nightmares started and wouldn't stop, until even music couldn't drown out the screaming in his head. James channeled all of it into Chopin's masterpiece. His body tensed as he navigated the technically treacherous final page. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill that had followed him from the streets. The regular pianist, Jake, had returned from his break, standing at the edge of the room. Professional assessment gave way to undisguised awe as he watched James's hands. "Juilliard," Jake whispered to no one in particular. "Definitely Juilliard. Maybe even their master's program." A woman at a nearby table dabbed at her eyes, mascara smudging. An older gentleman nodded rhythmically, recognizing each perfectly executed phrase. James approached the final measures, the thundering bass octaves, the right-hand arpeggios that spanned nearly the entire keyboard. The most difficult passage, the moment where even accomplished pianists sometimes faltered. His hands remembered. Despite everything, homelessness, hunger, years without practice, his hands remembered. The final notes rang out, resonant and defiant. Then silence. Complete silence. James remained still, eyes closed, hands resting on the final chord, allowing the resonance to fade naturally, a performer's instinct. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, 5, 10. Then someone gasped. A sharp intake of breath that seemed to break a spell. Applause erupted. Not the polite, obligatory applause of upscale venues, but genuine, spontaneous appreciation. Someone called "Bravo" from the back of the room. The woman with smudged mascara was openly crying now. James opened his eyes, returning to the present moment, to the ivory room, to his reality. He stood slowly, military posture reasserting itself. He gave a slight formal bow, the kind taught at conservatory. Then he turned to face Phillips. The manager's expression was unreadable. Shock battled with calculation behind his eyes. The script had been completely upended. A homeless veteran had just delivered a world-class performance in his establishment. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Phillips managed, his voice stripped of its earlier condescension. "Juilliard," James answered simply. "Class of 2010, before I enlisted." Jake, the regular pianist, stepped forward. "That was Chopin's Ballade number 1 in G minor, one of the most technically challenging pieces in the repertoire." He extended his hand to James. "Masterfully played, sir." James shook the offered hand, musician to musician, a flicker of his former life. The older gentleman who had recognized Juilliard technique approached, leaning heavily on an ebony cane. "Young man, I'm Richard Harrington. I sat on the board at Boston Symphony for 20 years. He studied James with shrewd eyes. "What happened to you?" The directness of the question created another moment of silence. Even in upscale venues, there was usually a polite avoidance of uncomfortable truths. James met his gaze steadily. "Afghanistan happened, sir. Then PTSD, then the system." Harrington nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion. "And now you're playing Chopin for dinner." "If I'm permitted," James replied, glancing at Phillips. All eyes turned to the manager, whose carefully curated world had been disrupted. Phillips cleared his throat, buying time. "Well, that was certainly unexpected." His voice attempted to reclaim authority. "But this isn't an audition venue, Mr. Walker," James supplied. James Walker. "Mr. Walker, while that was impressive, I'm afraid we have regular entertainment already scheduled." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. Emily, the bartender, stared at her boss in disbelief. "Carson," Harrington said quietly, using the manager's first name with deliberate familiarity. "Perhaps you could make an exception this evening?" Phillips hesitated, caught between preserving his authority and alienating influential patrons. "I suppose we could arrange something for tonight, as a special circumstance." James stood quietly during this negotiation of his worth. He had asked for food, not charity or pity. His dignity remained intact despite everything. He had proven himself the only way he knew how. "Actually," Jake interjected, "I wouldn't mind sharing my set tonight." He turned to James with genuine respect. "It would be an honor, Mr. Walker." The room waited for Phillips's verdict. The manager forced a tight smile. "Well then, it seems we have a guest performer tonight." He gestured toward the kitchen. "I'll have the chef prepare something for you, Mr. Walker." James nodded thanks, but remained standing by the piano. The battle wasn't over. This was temporary kindness, not restoration. One meal didn't change his reality, but for the first time in years, people saw him, not his circumstances. Him. James sat alone at a small table near the piano, the remains of a proper meal before him, his first in days. Roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Simple food that tasted like salvation. He ate slowly, methodically, military habits preserving dignity even in hunger. Across the room, Patrons pretended not to watch him. Their glances held new curiosity, the puzzle of how someone so talented could end up so broken. The cognitive dissonance of excellence and homelessness coexisting. Jake returned to the piano for his regular set, playing with newfound self-consciousness. His competent jazz standards now seemed pedestrian after James's performance. Still, he played with professional consistency, nodding respectfully to James between pieces. Phillips had retreated to his office, the disruption to his carefully ordered world requiring recalibration. Emily delivered James's food with genuine warmth, lingering to ask questions about Juilliard and his training. He answered politely but briefly, conserving energy. Richard Harrington remained at his table, watching James with assessment rather than pity. When James finished eating, Harrington gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Join me, Mr. Walker?" Just for a moment. James hesitated, then nodded, carrying his water glass to Harrington's table. 23 years on the Boston Symphony Board, Harrington began without preamble. I've heard thousands of pianists. Your technique needs rehabilitation, but your interpretation, he paused. That came from somewhere beyond training. James looked down at his hands clean now, after Emily had discreetly pointed him to the restroom. Music was my first language, before words. And after words failed, Harrington observed. Afghanistan, you said. Third tour. IED took half my unit. I was the medic. James's voice remained even, factual. Couldn't save most of them. Harrington nodded, allowing silence to acknowledge what platitudes couldn't. And afterward? VA was overwhelmed. Nightmares got bad. Couldn't hold jobs. Apartment went. Then everything else. James didn't elaborate. The story was common enough. Kept my discharge papers, my mother's photo. Not much else. But you remembered Chopin, Harrington noted. Perfectly. Music doesn't leave you. James looked toward the piano, even when everything else does. Jake finished his set to polite applause, considerably warmer than before. He approached their table. Mr. Walker, I meant what I said earlier. I'd be honored if you'd play a few pieces. The guests are asking. His sincerity was evident. Whatever you'd like to play. James looked at Harrington, who raised an eyebrow in encouragement. It seems you have an audience, Mr. Walker. Emily appeared at Phillips's office door, speaking intently. The manager emerged, surveying the room. Several patrons approached him, gesturing toward James. Phillips's expression suggested an internal calculation weighing customer satisfaction against disrupted protocols. James stood. Thank you for the meal. The food was earned, Harrington replied. Your talent demands compensation. James moved toward the piano as Phillips intercepted him. Mr. Walker, Phillips said, voice carefully modulated for nearby patrons. Our guests have expressed interest in hearing you play again. The forced smile remained, but his eyes were shrewd. Perhaps a shorter piece this time? Something more accessible? The suggestion carried clear implication entertainment, not art. Background music, not performance. James simply nodded and continued to the piano. He sat, adjusted the bench again, and considered his options. Accessible. He almost smiled. He had played for wounded soldiers in field hospitals. He knew about accessibility. He began with Debussy's Clair de Lune, beautiful but familiar enough to establish comfort. His technique remained impeccable, but he imbued the piece with subtle complexity, transforming the often played work into something fresh. By the final delicate notes, the room had fallen completely silent again. Without pausing for reaction, he transitioned to Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, adapted for solo piano. The jazzy opening clarinet glissando translated perfectly to keyboard under his hands. The piece built from bluesy intimacy to orchestral grandeur, showcasing technical brilliance and emotional range. Conversation ceased entirely. Service staff paused mid-task. Jake watched from the bar, shaking his head in amazement. As the Gershwin concluded, genuine applause erupted again. James acknowledged it with a slight nod, then turned to his audience. "Any requests?" he asked quietly. The question opened floodgates. Patrons called out favorites, some classical, some jazz standards, some pop songs. James accommodated each with arrangement skills that transformed simple requests into sophisticated interpretations. A businessman requested Piano Man for his wife's birthday. James delivered it with respectful homage to Billy Joel while adding subtle classical flourishes that elevated the familiar tune. An elderly woman asked for Schubert's Impromptu Op. 90 No. 3, her late husband's favorite. James played it with such tenderness that she wept openly, thanking him afterward. The atmosphere in the ivory room transformed. The invisible barriers between tables dissolved as strangers discussed the music, made joint requests, shared stories of concerts and memories attached to pieces. Phillips observed from the periphery, his business sense overriding his initial discomfort. The bar sales had increased significantly. Patrons who had planned to leave after one drink were ordering second and third rounds. The energy had shifted from polite restraint to genuine engagement. James played for nearly an hour, lost in the interaction between musician, instrument, and audience. This wasn't performance as he'd known it at Juilliard formal, technically evaluated, pressure-filled. This was music as communication, as shared experience. During a brief pause between pieces, the red-faced executive who had mocked him earlier approached the piano, his earlier arrogance replaced by shame-faced sincerity. "Sir, I owe you an apology," he said, just loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "My behavior earlier was inexcusable." James met his eyes without resentment. "No apology needed. I'd like to request something, if I may. Something to honor our veterans." He hesitated. "Perhaps America the Beautiful?" James considered the request, understanding its intent. Without comment, he began playing not with simple patriotic fervor, but with complex emotion that acknowledged both love of country and the cost of service. His arrangement incorporated subtle echoes of taps in the left hand, a musical subtext that veterans in the room would recognize. As the final notes faded, a retired Army colonel in the corner stood, raising his glass in silent toast. James acknowledged him with the slight nod of one soldier to another. The moment crystallized something in the room, a recognition of the person behind the performance, the journey behind the talent. Not just a homeless veteran who could play, but a complete human being with history, skill, and dignity. Harrington approached the piano again, leaning on his cane. "Mr. Walker, would you honor us with one final piece of your choosing, something that speaks to your journey?" James sat quietly for a moment, considering. Then he began to play Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, the second movement. The piece unfolds with deceptive simplicity, its gentle melody concealing profound emotional depth. In James's hands, it became a meditation on resilience, not triumph, not tragedy, but the quiet persistence that lies between. The room collectively held its breath. Every note carried meaning beyond technique. This wasn't performance. It was testimony. As the final notes lingered, James remained still, eyes closed. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, perfect and complete. Then, from the back of the room, a single voice. "Thank you." The words broke the spell. Applause began, not the enthusiastic outburst of earlier, but something deeper, something reverent. James opened his eyes to see Emily wiping tears, Jake standing in professional respect, Harrington nodding with quiet understanding, and Phillips, the manager, watching with an expression that had transformed from calculation to genuine recognition. The applause continued as James stood and bowed properly, the formal acknowledgement of a trained performer. For a moment, He wasn't a homeless veteran in a weathered jacket. He was a concert pianist acknowledging his audience. As the applause finally subsided, Harrington spoke, his voice carrying authority earned through decades in the music world. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been privileged tonight, truly privileged." He turned to James. "Mr. Walker, would you be willing to return tomorrow evening as our featured performer?" The question hung in the air, not charity, but professional recognition. James looked at Harrington, sensing there was more behind the offer than a single evening's engagement. "I would be honored," James replied simply. Phillips stepped forward, business instinct prevailing. "We would be pleased to feature Mr. Walker in a special performance tomorrow," he announced, seamlessly incorporating the disruption into his establishment's narrative. "Reservations are recommended." Conversations erupted throughout the room. Patrons approached James with business cards, handshakes, personal stories of how his playing had moved them. The red-faced executive pressed $200 bills into his hand, waving away any protest. For tonight's performance, professional to professional. Through it all, James maintained his composure, accepting the attention with quiet dignity. This wasn't restoration yet, just a moment of recognition. Tomorrow remained uncertain. The streets awaited him when the ivory room closed. As if reading his thoughts, Harrington motioned him aside. "You need a place to stay tonight." To prepare properly for tomorrow. It wasn't a question. "The Wentworth Hotel is 2 blocks from here. My late wife and I kept a permanent suite. It's available to you." James began to decline, pride still intact despite everything. "It's not charity, Mr. Walker," Harrington interrupted firmly. "It's professional courtesy." One musician to another. "The suite has a practice piano. You'll need it to prepare." Emily approached with a business card. "The hotel's information, Mr. Walker. Mr. Harrington has already called them. You're expected." Her smile held genuine respect. "Your jacket, sir." She handed him his weathered military jacket, now carefully brushed clean by someone in the back. James accepted it with a nod of thanks. The small kindness nearly undid him more than the grand gestures. As he prepared to leave, Jake approached with an extended hand. "It was an honor sharing the stage, Mr. Walker." "I'll see you tomorrow." The room watched as James Walker walked toward the exit, his posture military straight despite exhaustion. Not as a homeless man being helped, but as an artist departing after a performance. The door closed behind him, leaving the ivory room forever changed. Word spread through Boston's music community overnight. By noon the next day, the ivory room had a waiting list. By 4 o'clock, Phillips had arranged for additional seating. By 6, when James arrived, a line stretched down the block. He paused across the street, observing the scene with disbelief. 24 hours ago, he'd been invisible, another homeless veteran merging with urban background. Now his name appeared on a hastily printed sign in the ivory room's window. Tonight, James Walker, piano virtuoso. The Wentworth Hotel suite had indeed contained a Yamaha Baby Grand. James had practiced until his fingers remembered their full capacity, then slept in a real bed for the first time in 18 months. He'd showered, shaved, and accepted the hotel's pressing service for his one set of clothes. His military jacket now hung clean and dignified on his still thin frame. Harrington met him at the service entrance, assessing him with approving eyes. "You look like yourself again, Mr. Walker." "Part of myself," James corrected quietly. "The part that matters tonight." Harrington gestured inside. "They're waiting." Phillips greeted them in the hallway, his manner transformed. Gone was the condescension, replaced by professional deference. "Mr. Walker, we're honored to have you perform tonight." He extended a formal contract. Mr. Harrington suggested appropriate compensation. "If the terms are acceptable?" James scanned the document, a genuine performance contract with a respectable fee. not charity, employment. The terms are acceptable, he said, signing with steady hands. Phillips nodded, leading them into the main room. We've tuned the piano specially. Jake adjusted his schedule to allow you the full evening. The ivory room had been transformed. The usual scattered seating now faced the piano in concert arrangement. Every chair was filled. Standing room crowds lined the walls. James recognized faces from Boston's music scene critics, performers, conservatory faculty. Word had indeed spread. Conversations hushed as he entered. Eyes followed his movement toward the piano. Recognition dawned on faces as patrons from the previous night pointed him out to newcomers, whispering his story. Emily appeared at his elbow with water and a discreet, reassuring smile. Jake nodded respectfully from the bar. Even the kitchen staff peered through the service window. James reached the piano and stood beside it, facing the audience. The room fell completely silent. "Good evening," he began, his voice quiet but clear. "Thank you for coming." He paused, gathering thoughts. This was no longer about food or shelter or even personal redemption. The moment had expanded beyond him. "Yesterday, I came here hungry. Today, I come as a musician." He gestured to the piano. "Music saved my life in Afghanistan. Perhaps it's saving me again." Without further introduction, he sat and began to play. He opened with Bach's Prelude in C, major deceptively simple notes building into complex emotion. The piece established technical credibility while creating an atmosphere of clarity. From there, he moved into a carefully structured program that showcased both technical mastery and emotional depth. Liszt's Un Sospiro demonstrated his recovered technique, the cross-handed arpeggios executed with fluid precision. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata followed, the familiar piece transformed through his interpretation into something newly devastating. After each piece, applause washed through the room, not the restrained appreciation of typical classical audiences, but genuine emotional response. James acknowledged it with formal bows, professional rather than grateful. Phillips observed from the back, watching his establishment transform from upscale bar to concert venue. The drinks flowed freely, patrons ordering expensive bottles rather than glasses. Business was exceptional, yes, but something else was happening. Something beyond profit. During a brief intermission, Harrington introduced James to key figures from Boston's music community: a conservatory director, a symphony board member, a public radio host. Each exchanged cards, made tentative inquiries about availability, future engagements. James responded with measured professionalism, neither eager nor hesitant. For the second half, James moved into more personal territory. Selections that told his story without words. Barber's adagio for strings in piano arrangement spoke of loss. Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man acknowledged his military service. Gershwin bridged his classical training and American experience. He concluded with Chopin's Ballade Number 1 in G minor, the piece from the previous night, now performed with fully recovered technique and emotional freedom. The audience leaned forward collectively as he approached the difficult final section, then erupted into a standing ovation as he executed it flawlessly. James stood, bowing formally. The applause continued, undiminished. He raised his hands for quiet, and the room immediately responded. "For my final piece tonight, I'd like to play something special." He settled back at the piano. "When I was in Afghanistan, I composed this for my unit. For those who didn't come home." He began playing a piece unknown to the audience. Original composition. It opened with haunting simplicity, then built with subtle complexity. Military rhythms underpinned classical structures. Moments of chaos resolved into unexpected beauty. The narrative was clear even without words: service, sacrifice, loss, remembrance, and finally, a kind of peace. As the final notes faded, complete silence filled the room. Not a cough, not a shifted chair, not a whispered comment. Perfect stillness. Then, slowly, the audience rose to their feet. No applause at first, just standing in silent respect. The gesture of honor reserved for truly transcendent performances. Finally, one person began to clap, then another. Then the entire room erupted into sustained applause. James stood, deeply bowing to acknowledge the response. As he straightened, he saw something unexpected. Phillips wiping away tears, all pretense abandoned. Emily beaming with unabashed pride. Jake applauding with professional respect. Harrington nodding with quiet satisfaction. The red-faced executive from the previous night approached the piano, no longer intoxicated or arrogant. "Mr. Walker," he said, voice carrying in a momentary lull in the applause, "my firm would be honored to sponsor a proper concert series at Symphony Hall." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Phillips stepped forward, business instinct perfectly aligned with the moment. "And the Ivory Room would be privileged to serve as Mr. Walker's home venue between concert engagements," he announced. "With appropriate compensation, of course." The audience applauded these offers, the story's resolution satisfying their sense of justice. James stood at the center of it all, outwardly composed while inwardly astonished at the reversal. Harrington made his way to the piano, leaning heavily on his cane. He spoke quietly for James alone. "You never stopped being who you are," he said. "The world just temporarily forgot to notice." James nodded once, understanding the truth of it. His talent had always remained. His worth had never diminished. Circumstances had changed, not essence. As the applause finally subsided, James Walker stood not as a homeless veteran, not as an object of charity or pity, but as a pianist being recognized for his gift. The transformation was complete, not because he had changed, but because others had finally seen him clearly. The crowd lingered long after the final note, reluctant to let the evening end. Patrons approached James with business cards, handshakes, and invitations. Critics scribbled notes for tomorrow's reviews. Music students asked technical questions about his interpretation of Chopin. Through it all, James maintained his composure, gracious but reserved. The military discipline that had carried him through homelessness now served him in this unexpected spotlight. Phillips moved through the room, simultaneously managing his establishment and positioning himself within this new narrative. "We discovered him," he told influential patrons, conveniently omitting his initial dismissal. "The Ivory Room has always supported veterans and the arts." Emily caught James's eye from behind the bar, her slight smile acknowledging the irony. James responded with a barely perceptible nod. The truth of yesterday mattered less than the possibilities of tomorrow. Harrington orchestrated introductions with quiet efficiency, connecting James with people who could translate tonight's success into sustainable opportunities. The conservatory director discussed teaching possibilities. The symphony board member mentioned outreach programs for veterans. The public radio host scheduled an interview. "Small steps back," Harrington murmured between introductions. "One day at a time." As the crowd finally thinned, the red-faced executive, now introduced as Thomas Brennan of Brennan Financial, approached with formal paperwork. "This confirms our sponsorship of your initial 3 concerts," he explained, handing James a folder. "The Symphony Hall event is already being scheduled. We've arranged in advance to secure appropriate accommodations and necessities." He hesitated. "It's good business for us association with artistic excellence, but it's also the right thing to do." James accepted the folder with a firm handshake. "Thank you, Mr. Brennan." "We failed you," Brennan said simply. "Not just me. The system, society. We can do better." Phillips approached as Brennan departed. "Mr. Walker, I've had our chef prepare a special meal, a proper celebration." He gestured toward a private dining area. Your guests are welcome, of course. The invitation from a man who had nearly had him removed by security the previous night crystallized the transformation, not just of James's circumstances, but of how he was perceived, how he was valued. "Thank you," James replied. "I'd be honored." He followed Phillips toward the dining area, pausing at the piano to brush his fingers lightly across the keys, a private gesture of gratitude to the instrument that had restored his visibility. 3 months later, James Walker returned to the Ivory Room. Not as a desperate man seeking food, but as its headline performer every Thursday night. The transformation extended beyond his professional resurrection. Regular meals had filled out his frame. A proper apartment in Back Bay, modest but dignified, had replaced the shelters and park benches. New clothes, appropriate for his position, had replaced his weathered uniform. Only his military jacket remained, now professionally restored and worn on special occasions as a deliberate reminder. The Ivory Room itself had evolved. Phillips had leaned into its new identity as a serious music venue, the piano taking literal and figurative center stage. Reservations now required weeks of advance notice, especially for James's performances. Critics regularly attended. Music students filled standing room. Tonight, James arrived early, nodding to the new doorman who greeted him by name. Emily, now promoted to assistant manager, met him inside. "Full house again," she reported with a smile, "and a special guest, that VA administrator you wanted to meet." James nodded, satisfaction evident. His resurrection had a purpose beyond personal redemption. "Back room after the performance?" "All arranged," Emily confirmed. "Mr. Harrington arrived early. He's in your usual booth." James made his way through the room, accepting greetings from regular patrons. The path to the piano, once an obstacle course of judgment, now cleared respectfully before him. Harrington watched his approach with approval. Their relationship had evolved from rescuer rescued to genuine friendship and professional collaboration. The older man's connections had opened doors, but James had walked through them on his own merit. "The Copland piece is confirmed for the Symphony Hall program," Harrington reported without preamble, "and the Veterans Music Therapy Initiative received its funding. 10,000 to start." James settled into the booth, genuine pleasure warming his expression. "That's the 3rd program this year." "Your name carries weight now," Harrington observed, "in both music circles and veterans advocacy." The comment acknowledged what they both understood. James had deliberately leveraged his restored visibility to illuminate others still in shadows. Each concert included at least one composition highlighting veterans' experiences. Each interview mentioned the systemic failures that created veteran homelessness. Each paycheck partially funded music programs in VA facilities. "The feature in the Globe helped," James acknowledged, "especially mentioning the 22 veterans we lose daily to suicide." "Your story gives others hope," Harrington said simply. "Both the fall and the return." Phillips approached their table, his former condescension replaced by genuine respect. "Mr. Walker, whenever you're ready." The piano was tuned this morning as requested. James nodded thanks. Their relationship remained professionally cordial, the past neither forgotten nor dwelled upon. Phillips had made amends in practical ways, hiring 2 homeless veterans as staff, implementing a monthly benefit concert for the local VA hospital, establishing a performing arts scholarship for returning military. As James moved toward the piano, he passed the bar where Jake now served as music director, coordinating the expanded performance schedule. They exchanged professional nods, colleagues rather than symbols in each other's stories. The room quieted as James took his place at the piano. No introduction needed now. No justification required. He belonged here, not through charity or novelty, but through earned respect. He began with his own composition, Visibility, the piece he'd debuted 3 months ago on his first night. It had since been recorded, published, and featured on classical radio. Its narrative remained powerful, The journey from invisibility to recognition, from silence to voice. As he played, James observed the room from his unique vantage point. The Ivory Room's patrons now included people from across Boston's social spectrum, wealthy executives alongside conservatory students, retired military officers beside young professionals. Music had created a space where conventional barriers temporarily dissolved. In the back corner, a recent addition to the audience, a group of veterans from the local VA hospital attending through the scholarship program James had established. Their presence reminded him of his purpose beyond performance. After the concert, in the private dining room, James met with the VA administrator, discussing expansion of the music therapy program. The meeting represented the completion of a circle from failed by the system to changing it from within. Later that night, as James walked home to his apartment, keys in pocket, security in place, dignity restored, he passed a homeless man huddled in a doorway. Without hesitation, he stopped. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's a shelter 3 blocks east with open beds tonight, and a meal program tomorrow where I volunteer. I can show you." The man looked up, suspicious at first, then sensing genuine understanding rather than condescension. "You been there?" he asked, meaning more than just the shelter. "Yes," James answered simply. "I've been there." The music was always there, waiting to be heard. James extended his hand, helping the man to his feet. 2 veterans, different stages of the same journey, one invisible, one finally seen. Both human, both worthy of dignity. The circle continued. Experience powerful tales of justice, redemption, and hidden talent with PAP Stories. We craft emotional narratives where underdogs rise through genuine skill and perseverance. Our stories celebrate those who overcome judgment through talent and dignity. Perfect for your commute, workout, or any time you need inspiration. Hit subscribe and join our growing community of listeners who believe in second chances and the power of being truly seen.